Hello, Ayo Akinwolere here, and welcome to the Athletic FC podcast. Adu has resigned as Arsenal sporting director and is expected to join Nottingham Forest owner Evangelos Marinakis' portfolio of clubs. So why has Adu left the Gunners at a critical point of their project under Mikel Arteta? I'm joined by the Athletics football correspondent David Ornstein, plus Arsenal writer Art de Roche as well. Gents, good to have you with us. David, let's start with you, really. I'd really love to just gauge from your perspective how much of a loss this is for Arsenal. And also, when I heard the news, I'm thinking legacy. What do you think some of the achievements and the highlights have been for Edu since he first joined the club the second time around, I should say, as technical director in 2019?
Firstly, it's a big shock, definitely, to Arsenal as a club, a hierarchy, a staff, players, fan base, because they didn't know this was definitely going to happen. There have been rumblings. If we go back to the summer, there were reports coming out of Brazil that Evangelos Marinakis wanted Edu. He was targeting him to come into his group of clubs. We made checks at the time. People sort of laughed it off, denied it. There was no suggestion that it was a serious possibility that Edu would be leaving. It went quiet for a while. And in recent weeks, we received fresh information that this was actually happening. Now, we made our checks and we got a bit of pushback, we got a bit of confirmation, but we weren't quite there to run the story. And then fast forward to the beginning of this week, great scoop by Sammy Mokbel in the Daily Mail that Edu was leaving. And many people at Arsenal found out via those news stories. And so that's always going to sit a bit uneasily with you when you're a colleague of his, a superior, an inferior, or anybody that cares about the club. It was confusing for many of them. It would have created a lot of uncertainty. What does this mean for us? What does this mean for me? Why has this come about now? So many questions swirl around. And the bottom line is that, even if this is something that was going to come about maybe at the end of the season, for example, Arsenal would have had time to prepare themselves for it. But coming at this point in the campaign is a real jolt. It's their third season in which they'll try to challenge Manchester City and Liverpool and others for the Premier League title. They've established themselves back in the Champions League now. It's kind of the time that they would have seen themselves delivering. For example, Rodri out for Manchester City, a really good opportunity. Liverpool doing really well, but with a new manager. Arguably, Arsenal were the most settled, and everything that had been spoken about by Edu was very positive and forward-thinking and invested in the project. You'll remember when Arsenal signed a player, and there was a video that was put out by the club where Edu explained to the new signing why there was a black Premier League sort of trophy outline on the wall at the training ground. And he said, because we're not going to make it a gold one until we've won the actual trophy. And that was his vision and his thinking. And, only in September, he was pictured alongside Mikel Arteta when Arteta's new contract was signed and announced, and Edu's comments and Arteta's comments were very much pointing towards a partnership between those two, but also the club that was going to go on into the future for many years. And so this would have sent shockwaves through Arsenal, no doubt about it. But at the same time, this rise that Arsenal have been on since Edu came in, really, 2019, over that 5-year span, has not been just about him. There have been a number of protagonists involved in this. Mikel Arteta at the heart of it, going from head coach to manager. They won the FA Cup together in 2020. They've challenged for the Premier League title. They've got back into Europe's top tier competition. Around the sporting structure, you have Jason Ato, who has stepped up to be assistant to Edu, and he's also highly regarded. You've got Richard Garlick, who was working alongside Edu on contracts and has since succeeded Vinay Venkatesham, who was the chief executive, and Garlick has become the managing director. You've got Tim Lewis, who's the sort of executive vice chairman, or basically the most influential director, alongside the Kroenkes, of course, the ownership, the ultimate power here. That's Josh Kroenke, the son of Stan Kroenke, at the top of the tree. There are others in and amongst that mix. Juliet Slot, you've got James King coming in from the PFA. He's their general counsel. He will become head of football operations, which was the role vacated by Richard Garlick. And so even around Mikel Arteta, there's a strong coaching staff. So this is not a one-man show. And we've got to remember that. Arsenal will be confident that they've got a robust setup that I'm sure they will add to going forward to remain competitive, maybe even get better. And they're certainly presenting a united front in these days after the shock news. But to go back to your point on sort of highlights and landmarks of Edu's reign, I think he's helped modernise Arsenal immeasurably. He immediately set about the recruitment operation, and that department took some very tough decisions on the departure of some excellent and long-serving professionals who knew Arsenal inside out and were very well regarded in the industry. He made Arsenal's recruitment department, in his words, sort of more slimline, trying to scout more intelligently, less in person, more through video, using his connections and contacts, agents, clubs, his charisma and charm as a former player and a really strong character, to reshape the way Arsenal went about things in the market. And he has laid down a massive marker. Arsenal have gone from an operation that, yes, were well thought of, but maybe in terms of this sporting director role that they haven't had for too many years before Edu, to being the sort of model for many. When I've spoken to clubs around Europe, they say the way Edu and Arsenal are doing it is how we need to do it. And that sort of discourse has not been the case for a long time. Then he, after laying those foundations, went about rejuvenating the squad in terms of signings, and we will go through a number of those, but also moving out players at great expense and with great difficulty to what Arsenal would describe as clean up the dressing room, get rid of egos that they didn't want, players who weren't playing and so were unhappy. And then crucially, connect with Mikel Arteta and form this real bond between now manager and sporting director. Previously, it was head coach and technical director. And they've been really tight over the time, to the extent that Edu will have small conversations with Mikel Arteta after training sessions, after matches, in which they will pick over the performance, the results. Edu carries great respect because he's an invincible. He's played at club and international level. He's a legend of Arsenal. And so Arteta will listen to and place great value in Edu's feedback. Even just snatch chats here or there at the end of each day, as Mikel Arteta described it as one interview. He'll have a little chat with Edu. Edu can then connect to the other directors, executives, the board, and really he was at the heart of driving Arsenal to the point they're at today. But that doesn't mean he's irreplaceable, and despite all of his good work, and I'm sure Arsenal will wish him well in his next challenge, whatever the reasons are for it, and we can get into that, but they will believe that they are well set to go on and actually build and flourish and thrive in the future.
Yeah, I mean, Sounds like we're mourning him up, but he's still very much with us. And I actually think David's maybe soothed a lot of the worries of a lot of Arsenal fans right now. But, you talk about, what he does behind the scenes, Art. And Amy Lawrence wrote this lovely piece about Edu, and she spoke about his ability as a communicator and negotiator. And David also alludes to the fact that, in fact, he's had to clear some, dead wood in many respects. You think about Lacazette, you think about Ozil, you think about Aubameyang, but also he's brought in some top players as well, hasn't he?
Yeah, I think the big thing with Edu is it's not been an easy job, and everyone should really keep that context in mind when you think of the squad just before 2021, which was, I think, their big push from a recruitment perspective. He had the likes of Ozil to get rid of, Aubameyang as well. A few other examples of Mustafi, Socrates, Kolasinac as well. They're a bit less high profile, but even this summer, Edu spoke about the age profile and comparing that to the wage of the player and how that's really important, I guess, for the makeup of your squad. So that's a really important, I guess, issue for him to address. But then when you look at the recruitment side of things, and I said 2021 because that's the year Arsenal, I think, recruited 6 players all under the age of 23. So Martin Odegaard, Aaron Ramsdale, Tomiyasu, Lokonga, Ben White, and Nuno Tavares. So all those 6 players under the age of 23, some of those have worked out extremely well, like Odegaard, who's now club captain. Others haven't worked as well, but Arsenal weren't spending as much money as they had done on those talents. So I think that's where you see the importance of just having, I guess, a clear plan in how you want to move as a club. And with that, Arsenal have kind of found that stability that David was talking about earlier, which has really put their squad in a good position to grow with each other, but also compete for the Premier League.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, let's get some reaction from another one of our Arsenal writers, James McNicholas, on how the news has gone down with Arsenal fans.
The news will, I think, still be sinking in. Probably a bit of a shock to many Arsenal fans. We'll still see him around in the Premier League. Looks as if he's going to be part of the network of clubs owned by Nottingham Forest owner Marinakis. And I think that's a big part of the appeal of this role for him, that kind of international dimension to the job. Multi-club network is something he's been interested in for some time. It's not something that Arsenal are currently pursuing or pursuing imminently. So I think this lends another dimension to his work as a kind of sporting director figure. I think he would have loved to have done it with Arsenal being a Premier League champion. He's come so close to that. But sometimes the timing is right. I think there's greater context here to consider, were there frustrations for him in his role at Arsenal? I think potentially, based on what we're hearing. He's been incredibly influential. A couple of years ago, he was promoted to be the sporting director rather than technical director. Ostensibly, that gave him control over the women's team, the academy side. I wonder if he sensed as well, perhaps, that the power base within the club was shifting more towards Mikel Arteta, who's become such a central figure to everything the club do there. And perhaps that was going to reduce his influence. For Arsenal, leaves them in an interesting position. What do they do? I mean, historically, they like to appoint internally. They do have an assistant sporting director in Jason Ato, who's been fantastic in the role by all accounts and would be a very logical promotion. But having worked closely with Edu for so many years, perhaps Edu will want to take him with him. We shall have to see about that. Yeah, it's a loss, certainly, but it's also an opportunity for fresh ideas, fresh thinking, fresh impetus. And I think Arsenal will be looking to seize upon that if they can.
Yeah, that was James McNicholas on Edu leaving Arsenal. Art, look, this is also the world of business, right? Top people will be headhunted by other people and they'll want to move on, and huge loss for Arsenal for sure. But, James mentioned Jason Ato there, assistant sporting director. He also mentioned that Arsenal like to promote from within. Does that feel like a logical step for Arsenal right now to fill that void that Edu's left?
It does. It's too early to say whether that will actually happen. But I think when you look at Ato's path at Arsenal, he's been at the club since 2014, started as a scout, and then Edu liked him, promoted him into that assistant sporting director role about 18 months ago. And since then, he's basically been Edu's right-hand man. And I think you can see, even in, say, the videos that David mentions when a new player is signed and you've got the behind-the-scenes look, Jason Ato is there in the background. Maybe he's not as recognisable a face as Edu, but he is there and he is involved. So I think it'll be really interesting, as James also said, whether they decide to promote from within, like they have done, say, with Richard Garlick as well, or if they decide to go for fresh eyes, because it is a position that I guess can seem quite intimidating from the outside, but I think you have to look at it as an opportunity to maybe grow even more than you possibly could have done if it's just kind of the same eyes looking over things that have been here for the past 5 years.
Yeah. David, what does he say about the potential growing influence of Mikel Arteta at Arsenal? We've previously spoken about the influence Jurgen Klopp had at Liverpool, and obviously Michael Edwards coming in and out of the club based on that power structure. What could this mean for Mikel Arteta and actually having a few more tentacles in the Arsenal operation?
Well, I think the obvious thing that people have drawn as a conclusion is that this is partly as a result of Mikel Arteta's growing influence and power, and the growing influence and power of Tim Lewis at executive level. I think that's a bit too simplistic. I don't know if it's true, or how big a role it would have played in Edu's decision, even if it was. Because Mikel Arteta was already extremely powerful. He had moved up from head coach to manager, which was a change that he wanted. And many people at and around the club felt that was not the right move at that moment in time for a young head coach in his first number one role. And doing very well, but sort of one step at a time. Should Edu have challenged him more, and did Edu challenge him more enough when he was in his role? In a way, that's all sort of periphery conversation, because Mikel Arteta has earned the right, I think, to grow in influence. And okay, that will potentially continue here, because I'm sure his voice will be considered, his input will be aired when Arsenal come to decide upon who is going to replace Edu. They've got to be careful, because in this continental structure that has formed, it really should be the sporting director who comes first, and then they appoint a head coach, manager, and they will most likely outlast them, whether that person gets sacked or decides to move on to another job. The sporting director is the consistent presence. And we have seen examples of where it has gone wrong by design or by default, just that the sporting director left and the manager was in position. You've got a dynamic at Newcastle where Eddie Howe has been the manager prior to the arrival of now two sporting directors. And it's not always easy. It takes time to gel, and maybe that gelling doesn't happen quickly or at all. And there are many more examples of this in football as well. And naturally, when you are already there as the manager, you are going to want to exert your influence as much as possible around the first team squad, around structures, processes, methods, training, and crucially the transfer market too, unless that's an area that you're not interested in. But clearly Mikel Arteta is, because many of the signings we know he has driven or been heavily involved in, and you suspect that will continue, and it may grow depending on what Arsenal do. It's interesting. He will know Jason Ayo very well, who is already sort of, at least in an interim basis, and the trip to Milan this week, etc., morphing into that leadership group in a more prominent way. He has to, because he was the deputy, and he, as Art articulates, he has become more visible and more involved. He's very well regarded among the industry and people he meets, Jason Ayo, in terms of very discreet, speaks multiple languages, really strong skill set, has improved in and been more involved in negotiations. But I think it's quite hard to, with all due respect to him and anybody else in the club at the moment, replicate the level of experience and charisma that Edu had as a former top level player with really strong connections. And that might not be possible with an internal solution. And it could lead Arsenal to look externally. as a personal opinion, not information or fact, think that is a more probable route at the moment. They will undertake a recruitment process that will be thorough. I don't think it will be quick. I noted that Amy said on the Handbrake Off podcast that Arsenal need to make a quick appointment because the January transfer window is looming. Well, I think their plans, whatever they may be, at least in outline, would probably already have been in place, and they've got some very capable people that can see them through that process. It would be more geared towards the summer, which is always a larger area of focus, and that gives them time, even though that this took them somewhat by surprise. They can do this properly, and if they are going to look externally, they really do have to do it properly, because that comes with greater risk than if you promote someone from within. Not that promoting from within is necessarily a guaranteed success. We saw at Liverpool when Michael Edwards left, Julian Ward succeeded him internally, but it wasn't long before Julian Ward had moved on himself. Then they went for an external solution temporarily in Jörg Schmadtke. That didn't work out amazingly well. Then they've carved their way towards what appears to be a very strong setup now, which has included a new sporting director and in Richard Hughes, and then a new head coach in Arne Slot. This is a really fascinating time. I would say that they do have the benefit at Arsenal from ownership level of having people that are vastly experienced in running sports clubs, franchises, and the Cronkies will have experienced change at this level before. Art pointed out that executive churn does occur. 5 years isn't a bad stint. People do come and go. It's not necessarily the end of the world. And although these circumstances are not ideal, and they come not long off the back of Arsenal not losing, but seeing their chief executive, Vinay Venkatesham, depart. So in the space of 1 calendar year, they no longer have a chief executive. They don't currently have a sporting director. But the structure has changed somewhat inside Arsenal. So they went from chief executive to managing director. I think Mikel Arteta and Edu both reported into Vinay Venkatesham as chief executive, which was a little bit unusual in its own right, that Arteta did not report into Edu. They both went up to the chief executive. Then the chief executive reported into the board, the directors, the owners. I think it was encouraged that also, the likes of Arteta and Edu have direct conversations and communication with the board. Now in the new setup, Richard Garlick as managing director, I think reports into the board, is less on the football side. And Arteta and previously Edu were going direct to the board. So there are moving parts in this, and quite possibly that played a role in Edu's decision. Do I feel comfortable with the sort of restructure? We'll find out in time. The offer or offers that have been presented to him to work elsewhere, it sounds, the proposal, we've reported an agreement has been reached with the Marinakis group, but at the time of reporting, contracts had not been signed and the exact role has not been finalised. So we'll just have to be patient on that. But the offer, as has been widely reported, is understood to have been extremely lucrative. But I do think Arsenal would have gone to great lengths and will be satisfied with the efforts that they made to keep him. There have been reports of counter offers. And in the circumstances, you've got to respect the man's decision. But back to your original point, I think this does, whether we like it or not, certainly in the public eye, put increasing emphasis on Mikel Arteta. And he's just signed a new contract. He's committed his future to Arsenal. And really now it's time to deliver. He's got everything you would imagine in terms of they've recruited heavily. You can scrutinise that, but he's been there for a fair amount of time. It's his squad, it's his club. People talk about it being, Arteta FC, and I don't think they mean that in a derogatory way, but, this is really on him. And so let's see how he reacts to that in the post-Edu world. Let's see how he assimilates with a future plan, whether somebody else comes in and works alongside him. It's a really fascinating and important, maybe a bit of a concerning time at Arsenal. But out of every you could call it a mini crisis, comes great opportunity. And I think that's the way Arsenal will be looking at it now.
Okay, very quickly before you go, David, you mentioned the potential package that might be on offer at Nottingham Forest and the wider group, in fact. I just, from a business sense, and I said it at the top of this when I start the question, top players in the game, will be headhunted. People doing great things, other people in other businesses will want to have a piece of that pie. Where does Edu rank, or what kind of status does he have within the world of football? And were there other offers on the table for him? Do we know?
Well, he has been linked with top positions in the past. I remember a couple of years ago, I think it was Paris Saint-Germain. There were some reports suggesting that they could be keen on him. And I'm sure many other clubs, associations, he did well at the Brazilian Confederation previously. He showcased his skill set. He used to hold the press conferences, announce team selections. This is a man of many talents. He came to Europe. His first job is with Arsenal, and he does very well in it. So, and then going back to the regard in which I earlier said he's held, there will be all manner of possibilities. I do think we have to caveat, although this is understood to be an extremely lucrative offer, this is a guy who would have earned well from his playing days, who is still relatively young and so has great earning potential ahead of him, and will have been really well remunerated at Arsenal to this point, and they would have been prepared to go further. So that points towards the fact that, yes, we all consider the financial side when we're making these decisions, but also the career opportunity. He's clearly, if he takes this and it's all signed, sealed, delivered, very close to Evangelos Marinakis on a personal level. There's been involvement of Kia Jarabchian, the agent, who Edu's very close to and is very close to Evangelos Marinakis. If Edu, like you mentioned Jurgen Klopp and others, have designs on working in this new fad, which is the multi-club model, he can't get that at Arsenal for the time being. Maybe they would do in the future. Whereas Marinakis has already got 3 clubs in Nottingham Forest, Olympiacos, Rio Ave, and they're looking to build more. And the proposal to Edu is to be at the heart of talks and expansion to grow that with more clubs and really drive a project forward. You could see how that would appeal from a professional perspective and maybe a personal lifestyle point of view too. So it places him at the heart of a project, and these projects are becoming the in thing within football. Let's see if it's done and dusted, because there have been suggestions that others still want him, and until something
hot
is
property
signed,
I like this.
Exactly, and this industry is changing, and maybe it's something that he has decided is the right step for him at this point in time. And I do think he is seen by pretty much everyone I speak to as a top operator at the vanguard of his industry, and somebody that whoever gets him is very fortunate and is going to benefit from. Arsenal benefited from him for 5 years, but that doesn't mean to say that they won't benefit in other ways from other people going forward. Bit of credit is deserved for the ownership. KSE, they were the ones who appointed him in the first place. So when everybody or many people panic about his departure, there's nothing to say that they won't appoint someone as good or who proves to be better going forward. And also, he wasn't their top choice when he came in 2019. That was actually Monchi, who I think was at Sevilla at the time. He had come out of Roma. He decided to go back to Sevilla. He's now at Aston Villa. So fear not, there are plenty more fish in the sea, and it's possible that everybody wins out of this. Edu goes on to a great future. Whoever gets him reaps the rewards, and that Arsenal go from strength to strength. Yeah,
amazing, David. Thanks for the inside scoop on that. And just to reiterate, Josh Kroenke, as you said, in a statement says, change and evolution is part of our club. We remain focused on our strategy and winning major trophies. Our succession plan will reflect this continued ambition. All right, appreciate your time, sir. Go off to your work. I know you've got lots to do, and we'll see you soon.
Just on something David said earlier about the support group around Edu, is something that I think is really important to realise. It's not just the men's team we're talking about. It's also the the women's team and the academy. And I think the timing as well is quite interesting with the women's team looking for a new head coach slash manager. Also, with the way things have gone, the restructure that saw Jason Aito step up 18 months ago also saw a guy called James Ellis step up into becoming Arsenal's head of recruitment. So there has been change that maybe hasn't been noticed all the time. But I think these are things where you realise it's not just Edu and Arteta that are making these decisions. And hopefully that kind of just paints the picture a little bit better for people who may not realise how many people are actually involved in what's going on at Arsenal Football Club.
I said it at the top. I'm worried as an Arsenal fan, but I'm sure other Arsenal fans are thinking the timing of this isn't really that great. You know, let's switch to our attention to on the pitch matters. You know, the news about Edu really has followed a string of not great performances from Arsenal. We think about 1-0 at Newcastle, you think about the Bournemouth result, you think about the draw against Liverpool when Arsenal were in a winning position, you think about the disciplinary issues. Arsenal are now 7 points behind league leaders Liverpool. Should fans be worried about this performance?
I think the performance against Newcastle was probably the most concerning, as well as the Bournemouth first half an hour when they had 11 men. What was concerning about it for me was when you're looking at it from a football perspective, they just weren't as connected as they tend to be. And that's where I think you look at, say, the Inter Milan game. We're recording before kickoff, so it'll be interesting to see how involved Martin Odegaard can be. And then that kind of repeats again for the Chelsea game, because, again, level on points now with Chelsea going into the international break. I think that's going to be a really important game. But I would also say it's kind of easy to catastrophize when all those things are happening at once. I think it's really important to have, I guess, a wider perspective on things. When you look at, say, Manchester City, obviously 3 losses in a row, all in different competitions, but that's something they actually tend to go through quite often. If you look at last year as well, they dipped a little bit as they headed into the winter time. So I think it'll be interesting to see how Arsenal kind of come through this period and where they are, say, after the turn of the year, because I think everyone knows they have quality. It's just about how do you assemble these parts properly and get them to actually look connected and fluid on the pitch.
Yeah, there's talk about Arsenal coming through this period, and there's two people actually. I'm thinking, wow, it's a fair bit of pressure. One, Mikel Arteta, after all what's going on in the background, he has to get these players in the right mindset to try and fulfill their ambitions for this season. But also, you mentioned there Odegaard as well. I mean, this is a player that's still coming off the back of injury, looks like he's training again. There's a fair bit of pressure on him to hit the ground running, really. And I wonder if that's a similar pressure that Saka faces as well, and whether or not Arsenal have become too reliant on these key figures to try and get them over the line.
Yeah, I think pressure's probably something Odegaard is expecting. He's captain of the club, and I think even when you look at his first few months at Arsenal as a lone player, he was one of the people who was looked at to bring creativity to the squad, and he did that. So I don't think he will have major issues, barring any kind of fitness ones, to really knit things together for Arsenal. Where he slots in the team, it's quite natural that those combinations with Saka will come. So hopefully there won't be too many more occasions where Saka and Martinelli are given the ball inside their own half and they just have to try and run for 50, 60 yards with it. But I do think there will be obviously an expectation on him to really help Arsenal come through this spell of tough form. I thought what was really interesting about the Newcastle game was actually Evangelos was given the most minutes in the Premier League he had been all season. So previously he'd come on for about 5-10 minutes. Against Newcastle, it was half an hour. Of course, he's only 17, so you have to kind of temper that expectation. But I think those are the two players you look at with technical ability that can move with the ball And that's what Arsenal are really missing to really knit things together. And hopefully, I'd say more so Ødegaard can bring that when he returns. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see also how the dynamic of the midfield changes away from the 4-4-2 that's been there for the past 6 weeks or so.
Right, now time to get more detail on Edu and this expected move to join Nottingham Forest owner Evangelos Marinakis and his collection of clubs. Let's welcome our Forest reporter Paul Taylor with us. Paul, this is a massive coup for Forest. If we go by the words of David Ornstein earlier, they're currently third in the table on 19 points, having picked up 5 wins from 10 league matches. But in terms of Edu, why do Forest, and more importantly Marinakis, want this guy?
Yeah, massive coup was the exact words I was going to use. So you've stolen my thunder there a little bit, but yeah, it really is. I mean, they don't just want him for Nottingham Forest. It's probably important to say that he will have a role to play at Forest, of course, but we're told that the role that he will take on will very much be as part of the overall Marinakis footballing empire, if you like, with Olympiacos and Rio Ave as well. So he'll oversee the 3 clubs, and also importantly, Marinakis has ambitions to add to that football empire by, perhaps even getting involved with further football clubs. He's been linked with Vasco in Brazil. I know there's other clubs in Europe that are perhaps under consideration as well. He does want to add to the football stable he's got, if you like. So we're told that any role that Edu has, and it's still to be confirmed exactly what his role will be, but what we do know is that it will be all-consuming over all the clubs that are involved in that group. So he won't just be working at Forest, he'll be working at Olympiacos and Rio Ave as well. And it is a real coup, to get somebody of his stature, somebody who's done such a good job at Arsenal, as we've just heard for the last 20 minutes, half hour or so. He's done an outstanding job at Arsenal, and to get somebody on board of his stature at Forest is a sign of how Evangelos Marinakis is keen to continue building the club on the pitch and also off it. They are third in the Premier League table. Nobody expected that, but they've done a lot of good recruitment. They've built the club, they've evolved, they've grown, and this is just another sign of their ambition to keep doing that on and off the pitch.
Yeah, you talk about ambition, and this feels like a signal of ambition. Do we have a sense of what Marinakis wants for Forest and his growing empire of teams? Because I look at Olympiacos, great brand, marketing-wise, top club in Greece. Nottingham Forest, would you like to see them in that kind of stature as well?
Yeah, I mean, when Forest were promoted back to the Premier League, they had a big celebration in the Market Square in Nottingham. And Marinakis made a brief speech where he actually said that his ultimate goal was to get Forest back into European football. And I think a lot of people had raised eyebrows over that, because they literally just got back into the Premier League and he was already voicing ambitions of that size. Now, I don't think anybody at Forest realistically thought it was going to happen this season, and it hasn't happened yet. Let's be realistic. They're third in the table now, which is fantastic. But all of a sudden, they're daring to dream that it might be a possibility, which hasn't been thought about before, probably. But all of a sudden, Forest fans are thinking, "Wow, we better check our passports, because next season we could be going into Europe." Which was, it seemed fanciful in the last couple of years when they fought battles against relegation, and now all of a sudden they're daring to at least dream of what might be possible. Possible is still very much the key word, but even that in itself is a huge step forward. And they have these big ambitions at Forest that all of a sudden maybe starting to appear like they could be more than just a pipe dream. It's exciting times for Forest fans at the minute.
Yeah, Art's just finished on this really. Paul talks about big ambitions. What does he say about Edu as an individual? Big ambitions. You go to Arsenal, spend a good bit of time there, recruitment, get it into shape. Now you're going to a much bigger conglomerate and multi-club model. What does that say about the man himself and what he sees for himself?
Well, he's still very young. When you look at the role he's in, I think a lot of his competition will probably be a bit more senior. But also when you look at just him in these situations, Arsenal was the first club in Europe he actually worked for in this regard. And he did so with, I guess, a bit of hardship at the start, but he grew into it quite well. And I think what's really important when you look at it from maybe a Forest or Marinakis perspective is he's got skill sets that maybe others don't have in terms of the language, with Portuguese, obviously. And then there's just his, I guess, vision for himself. How does he want to grow and almost be viewed more, not more seriously, because that's not the right way to put it, but in a more senior light, rather than being someone who's trying to facilitate for, say, Mikel Arteta's plans for the first team, which he done well. So it'll be really interesting to see how he develops professionally, because it is a very different kind of remit to what he had at Arsenal.
Yeah, brilliant. Let's end it there. Paul, Art, and also David from earlier, thank you so much for your time. We'll be back tomorrow. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.